In Star Trek Enterprise's United, it was supposed to end there, with peace. After the Romulan drone ship was destroyed, the tension between Earth, Andoria, Vulcan, and Tellar began to cool. Captain Archer had done the impossible. He'd laid the foundation for something new, something better. At least, that's what happened in the timeline we remember. But history is fragile, and one small divergence can change everything. In this timeline, one Romulan drone escaped. One deception remained, and that was all the Romulans needed. The next wave of incidents struck surgical targets. A Vulcan transport obliterated by what appeared to be Andorian disruptors. A Tellarite listening post vaporized after receiving falsified Earth codes. Starfleet transmissions intercepted, edited, rebroadcast. No one can prove it was Romulan, but no one else had the precision. And then, the Vulcans made their decision. They called it reunification, a return to order. Not a surrender, a choice. Where there is chaos, they said, there must be order. Where there is division, unity. Earth was stunned. Andoria was outraged. The coalition that might have become the Federation collapsed before it ever began. Now, two powers rise. One born in fire and secrecy, the other in frost and resolve. This is not the story we know. This is the story of what might have been. Of how the stars almost fell to logic. Within weeks of the Vulcan-Romulan unification, the balance of power began to shift. Vulcan warships were reassigned to joint defense patrols. Romulan diplomats arrived on Shikar. Vulcan scientists quietly withdrew from Earth's research stations. And for the first time, Starfleet ships were denied access to Vulcan space. Captain Jonathan Archer sent message after message. No response, no explanation, only silence. Then came the spark. A Starfleet listening post near Corridon picked up a distress signal. An Andorian mining transport was under attack. But it wasn't alone. A Klingon freighter was with it, trading materials peacefully. Both ships were hit. No warning, no chance to flee. Shran arrived first. He opened hailing frequencies. "Stand down. You're firing on civilians," he nearly begged. No reply. Just phasers. Precise, surgical, Vulcan. Shran's crew returned fire. They didn't have a choice. By the time Archer arrived, the field was full of debris. The Vulcan ships, now with cloaking technology, vanished. The Andorian miners were dead. The Klingon freighter was adrift, venting plasma. The Klingons were furious. They threatened retribution. They demanded names. But ultimately, and uncharacteristically, they did nothing. And that silence worried Archer most of all. The news spread fast. Shran stood trial in Andoria and was acquitted within the hour. They weren't Vulcan, he said. Not anymore. And he was right. They were Vulcan ships, Vulcan insignias, but their orders came from Romulus. And Earth watched in silence. Because the one thing no one wanted to admit that was becoming undeniable was that there was some kind of conflict, possibly a war, that was coming. They just hadn't recognized it yet. The Vulcans didn't call it a coup. They didn't call it conquest. They called it logic. The announcement came from the Vulcan High Command. To ensure galactic stability and reduce the risk of further conflict, the Vulcan people have entered into formal alignment with the Romulan Star Empire. We believe our presence will temper aggression. We do not seek domination, we seek to preserve peace. On Earth, the reaction was disbelief. On Andoria, outrage. But on Vulcan, something more dangerous was taking root. A rationalization. A belief that by joining the Romulans, the Vulcans could prevent war, not escalate it. That logic itself, unified, steady, unshakable, could guide the Empire from within. They weren't embracing Romulan rule. They were volunteering to cage the lion. But not all Vulcans agreed. Ambassador Saval quietly resigned from the Earth Embassy. He was seen boarding a Vulcan ship and then vanished from the public record. His name would not appear in high command rosters again. T'Pol was one of the few to act openly. She refused reassignment. She remained aboard Enterprise. Soon after, she filed papers to formally join Starfleet. She rarely spoke of Saval after that, only once noting that, "We still speak." Others followed. Some Vulcan officers joined Starfleet openly. A few even sought asylum on Andoria. It was unprecedented. Vulcans and Andorian, sworn enemies for centuries, now standing side by side, not in friendship, but in shared alarm. Still, the High Command moved forward. Vulcan warships began joint patrols of the newly formed neutral zone. Scientific exchanges were suspended. Romulan emissaries arrived in Shikar, cloaked in civility. And the powers that would ally to form the coalition that never existed had already fractured. There had been no battle, no invasion, no ultimatum, only a decision, made in quiet council chambers, delivered with perfect logic. The Vulcans had not been conquered, they had been aligned. And perhaps that was worse. It didn't start with phasers. It started with silence. The Vulcans and Romulans weren't attacking. Not openly. Not yet. But they were watching. Their warships patrolled the edge of Andorian space. Romulan listening stations blinked to life near Tellarite borders. And every Starfleet vessel in the sector found its comm traffic tripled. Analyzed, intercepted, shadowed. Earth called it caution. Shran called it cowardice. You don't wait for a fire to spread before you draw the line. You contain it. Fast, cold. The NX-class refits were rushed forward. Orbital defense platforms activated over Earth, Tellar Prime, and Andoria. Joint military drills began. Quietly. Officially, there was no conflict. But ships were being reassigned. Munitions stockpiled. New tactics developed. Everyone called it a defensive posture. But they were building a wall, and they knew it. Then came the conference. Tellarite delegates proposed a multilateral summit to prevent escalation. A final attempt at diplomacy. Shran opposed it. Archer endorsed it. The Tellarites demanded it happened on their terms. So it did. The Korvan summit brought Earth, Andoria, Tellar, and even a Vulcan observer. For a moment, it looked like the dream might be salvaged. And then, an explosion. No one saw the assassin, nor was the bomb traced. But 3 diplomats died, including the Tellarite ambassador who brokered the talks. and someone leaked an internal memo. Romulan, signed by a name Earth intelligence didn't know, but Shran did. Valdor. In response to the rising tensions, Vulcan and Romulan officials issued a joint communique. Effective immediately, all territorial and security matters shall be overseen by the Vulcan-Romulan Union, a unified body, a shared voice, a declaration of order. For Earth, it was confirmation. For Andoria, it was provocation. For the Tellarites, it was the final straw. That night, each government voted, unanimously. Earth, Andoria, and Tellarite would join a formal defense pact. And just like that, the Coalition of Worlds was born. Not out of hope, not out of vision, out of necessity, out of fear. And in the dark, somewhere beyond the new neutral zone, a Romulan signal beacon mysteriously went quiet. Not all Vulcans bowed, even as the High Command aligned itself with Romulus. Even as Vulcan ships patrolled under the banner of the Union, there were those who remembered Surak. Not just his logic, but his humility, his resistance to fear, his refusal to confuse order with obedience. Some stayed silent, some simply disappeared, and some defected. One such outpost, a Vulcan science installation deep in the Ancora Nebula, went dark for 30 hours. When it returned to contact, it wasn't to the High Command. It was to Starfleet. They transmitted full schematics of the VRU's new stealth modifications. Sensor disruptions, power cycling algorithms, tactical logs of 3 Romulan shadow fleets. The signal was brief, the encryption clean, and the final line of the transmission read, "Logic is not submission. Surak does not kneel." By the time Starfleet dispatched a ship, the outpost had been sterilized. No bodies, no survivors. Only residual warp signatures heading away from the Union, toward Klingon space. Shran was the first to notice. I've seen Vulcans defect. I've seen Vulcans resist. I've never seen them run, unless they had a plan. T'Pol said nothing. She only confirmed the signal's authenticity. When Archer asked if she knew who sent it, she hesitated, then said, "There are still Vulcans. You just have to look in the right places." Elsewhere, quiet messages began appearing in Andorian and Tellarite comms. Fragments of Vulcan poetry, mathematical ciphers traced to pacifist sects. Not enough for proof, but enough to raise questions. Was there another Vulcan movement forming? One that didn't seek to fight, but to leave. No one could confirm it. No one would really speak of it. But a name began circulating in Starfleet intelligence. Sirenites. The first shots weren't acknowledged. There were no declarations, no funeral processions. The Coalition cargo vessel, USS Mariposa, was destroyed on its way to Altair 6. Andorian warships found the debris, still glowing. Cloaked plasma trails traced back towards Romulan space. When Starfleet protested, the Vulcan-Romulan Union responded. Our ships are engaged in lawful neutral zone security patrols. If your vessels wandered into a classified zone, that is unfortunate. The Coalition had a decision to make: retreat or respond. They chose neither. Instead, they adapted. Shran commissioned a fleet of Andorian recon corvettes. Small, fast, expendable. Starfleet deployed sensor drones along key trade corridors. Tellarite engineers refit cargo haulers with phaser arrays. They called it civilian protection, but it was preparation for war. And then it happened again. The TCS Corvette, a Tellarite escort, vanished during an aid run to a refugee colony near Corridon. 2 days later, its hull was found fused to an asteroid. No escape pods, no survivors. Starfleet's official response was muted, but a message was sent. USS Curzon, NX class, tracked a cloaked signature leaving the debris field. It didn't fire, it followed. 3 hours later, it dropped out of warp near the Azure Veil. Waiting for them, a single Romulan warbird, flanked by 2 Vulcan cruisers. The Curzon powered weapons, but held position. So did they. For 10 minutes, nothing moved. No words exchanged. Just 4 ships, weapons hot, engines humming, waiting for one mistake. And then, the Romulan ship vanished. Cloaked. Gone. The Vulcans turned and followed. The Curzon returned to Coalition space with its shields at half, but its dignity intact. There were no headlines, no medals, just logs, footage, and a message passed from T'Pol to Archer. They're probing, not for territory, for resolve. And so the Coalition watched and waited. And behind the veil of diplomacy, they prepared. Because one skirmish was survivable. But the next one wouldn't be a test. It'd be a message. The Vulcan-Romulan Union continued moving deeper into disputed space. Not with fleets, with listening posts, with scientific missions, with border surveillance ships that just happened to be outfitted with plasma banks. They weren't conquering, they were shaping the battlefield, and the Coalition could feel it. The Azure Veil, once a trade corridor between Andoria and Corridon, now sat behind a wall of electronic interference. Tellarite convoys were rerouting through more dangerous lanes, and Starfleet had begun deploying automated sentry buoys just to hold the line. But it wasn't enough. One of Andoria's outer moons reported sensor interference. A surveillance satellite vanished over Corridon Prime, and in the border region near Klingon space, a Starfleet outpost flagged a strange anomaly. Vulcan warp signatures, the report read, but the waveform's off. Timing is inconsistent. The report was dismissed. User error, they said. Tense operators, overworked. The file was archived, but never reviewed again. Behind the scenes, the Coalition was unraveling. Shran demanded a preemptive strike on the nearest VRU forward station. The Tellarites threatened to pull their fleet if it happened. Archer just tried to hold it together. But even he knew the diplomacy was wearing thin. Andoria had begun evacuating its outer settlements. Earth had reinstated planetary defense shields for the first time in over a century. And Starfleet intelligence had quietly activated its Section 9 protocol, a war readiness classification not seen since the Xindi crisis. T'Pol brought a report to Archer's ready room. It was encrypted. Old Vulcan encryption. Inside, tactical data compiled from a Cyrnite outpost believed to be destroyed. They're still alive, she said. And they're not hiding, they're watching. Archer asked where the signal originated. T'Pol hesitated and then quietly said, Borath sector, Klingon space. Andoria's military council declared a heightened threat condition. The next attack would not be treated as a mistake. They called it containment. They called it restraint. But everyone knew the truth. The next strike wouldn't be deflected. The next death wouldn't be ignored. And when it came, Andoria would be victorious, or it would burn. It happened in a single day. 5 Coalition outposts went dark. The Starfleet dry dock in orbit of Altair 3 was destroyed, and a Romulan Vulcan strike group penetrated Andorian space. Fast, coordinated, devastating. Andoria scrambled its home fleet. Starfleet redeployed from Corridon and Earth. Even Tellarite command ships were pulled from patrol to reinforce the front. But it wasn't enough. The VRU had planned this. Their cloaked fleets moved in waves. Their targets weren't military, they were population centers. Terror, not conquest. By the time Archer's task force reached orbit, half the Andorian fleet had been annihilated. The ANR ice colonies were already gone. The VRU First Strike Wing arrived with ruthless precision. IRW Lashawn, a Romulan warbird, decloaked mid-orbit and cut through an Andorian defense platform in seconds. VNS Celia Kor, a Vulcan cruiser retrofitted with Romulan targeting AI, surgically dismantled a Tellarite battleship with brutal efficiency. The Coalition's front line formed in desperation. USS Curzon, Archer's command, INS Harath Kor, Shran's Andorian flagship, the TCS Grumble's Pride, a hastily armored Tellarite war barge running at 140% reactor load. They held, barely. Shields at 24%, hull breach on deck 9. Target lost cloaking, acquiring secondary. We've lost the Benjamin Maxwell. I repeat, we've lost the Benjamin Maxwell. One ship made the difference. USS Tempest, NX class, hull number 14. Experimental gravitic shielding, crewed by graduates, reservists, and one former pacifist, Captain Risa Nahiri. The Tempest flanked the Celia Corps, pulling its fire away from the fleeing ARC ships. No retreat, no backup, and just resolve. This is the Tempest. Your fight is with us, Vulcan traitors. It lasted 7 minutes. Enough to let 3 refugee transports break orbit. Enough to weaken the Celia Corps' shields for a Tellarite torpedo barrage. The Tempest never made it out. Then came the second wave. Coalition sensors lit up. Vulcan warp signatures. Perfectly timed, perfectly in sync. Everyone assumed it was the end. The final stroke. The killing blow. Shran commented that everyone should feel flattered. T'Pol scanned the formation. Vulcan warp signatures. But something's wrong. The waveform's imperfect. It's offset. Archer frowned. Is it camouflage? She looked again, and her voice dropped. No. It's fusion. They dropped out of warp, the entire fleet. Dozens of ships. Klingon hulls with Vulcan geometry. Aggressive outlines reinforced with defensive logic. Torpedo bays paired with plasma waveguides. Painted not in Romulan green, but red and bronze. They didn't fire on the Coalition. They fired through the VRU. On screen, a Klingon appeared, his armor fused with Vulcan alloy. At his side stood Saval. Still, controlled, present. Not as a diplomat, as a witness. The Klingon spoke. We remember your defense of our freighter. we remember the honor that Captain Shran had. And we remember who Vulcan was before it was broken. Saval stepped forward, measured, calm. We never stopped watching, only waiting. On the Harath core, Shran said nothing. On the Curzon, Archer just whispered, they came back. Andoria didn't fall, because Vulcan rose again. Not in isolation, but in unity. The war didn't end in a ceremony. No surrender, no treaty, just silence. The surviving VRU ships fled into deep space, abandoning Andoria, abandoning logic, abandoning the future. What came after was harder. Earth was tired. Andoria was broken. Tellar had lost a generation. The Coalition had won, but the cost had been too high to celebrate. In the weeks that followed, captains met in orbit. Envoys gathered in makeshift embassies on Proxima Centauri. And old enemies sat across from each other with nothing left to prove. It was Shran who proposed it. We've already bled together. Might as well build something from it. And it was Saval, seated silently in the back, who spoke up first. Let us define unity before someone else does. The new alliance wasn't perfect. It didn't outlaw war. It didn't erase the past. But it created something no other quadrant had ever seen. A multi-species council with rotational leadership. A charter based not on shared blood or territory, but shared values. Peace, mutual defense, cultural exchange, and a right of descent enshrined by design. They called it the United Federation of Planets. A temporary name, everyone thought. But the name stuck. The Klingons didn't join, not officially, but they kept a seat at the table, and they kept Saval close. As for Starfleet, it changed. No longer just Earth's navy, now something larger, older, wiser. The Vulcan-Romulan Union collapsed in silence. What remained of its fleets scattered to the stars. But Vulcan endured. Those who had fled the High Command, those who had fought to preserve Surak's teachings, they waited, they watched, and when the time was right, they returned. Not as rulers, not as soldiers, but as allies. Years later, when Vulcan petitioned for entry into the United Federation of Planets, it wasn't Earth who sponsored them, it was Andoria. Shran, the one who had once fought them, stood to welcome them back. In the years ahead, explorers would fly under its banner. Diplomats would argue under its laws. And historians would look back at the battle for Andoria, not as the end of something, but the beginning of something new. Because in a galaxy full of betrayals, empires, and ancient wounds, they chose unity.